It begins with a whisper and a ledger line, not with trumpets. A name buried in the margins. Maria Staritskaya, a child born to a house that kept its shoes beside the open grave. A daughter of the Staritsa line, the branch of the Rurikids that could have been czars and, because they could have been, were not allowed to be anything at all. In her blood there was an argument. In her cradle there was a verdict. They told her that a girl should not learn the taste of fear so young. They told her no such thing. Perhaps the nurses hushed each other in the corridors. Perhaps the icons on her nursery wall watched her the way saints watch the condemned, tenderly, helplessly. She learned early that voices go quiet when she enters. She learned that good news never visits her house without a shadow. Her father's name was a lesson. Vladimir of Staritsa, cousin to the terrible Tsar, circled by suspicion as men circle an icehole. It is one thing to be a claimant. It is another to be the cousin who reminds a ruler that his blood is not the only royal blood in Russia. The Tsar's gaze is a blade that never needs to be drawn. In that gaze, her house bowed, surrendered, complied. In that gaze, one winter, her father drank the cup that was handed to him and did not rise again. A small girl learns to read the world by reading faces. She learns that the adults around her speak in half words and end their sentences with silence. She learns that grief in great houses is always private and always obedient. If she cried to the hem of a candlelit robe and the hem did not answer. There are customs for women of her blood. There are veils and oaths and corridors that narrow as one grows older. There are decisions made in rooms where she will never be invited to sit. One of those decisions found her while she was still counting winters on her fingers. 8 winters old, and the elders of Russia set the ink to the page that bound her life to a man she did not know. Not a husband in the full, blooming sense. No one dared tender that fiction when her feet barely reached the floor. A marriage in the way courts make them. Papers, alliances, promises, traded like furs across a frozen river. 8 years old, and the world said she was safe because now she belonged to someone else. NHI's name was Magnus, a foreign prince with a borrowed crown, a king of Livonia, the way a puppet is a prince in a child's play. A stranger with a northern name who had pledged himself to Moscow's game board. To the men who arranged it, he was perfect, too far to threaten, close enough to be useful, grateful enough to kiss the hand that fed him. To her, he was a name, a symbol, a wax seal on parchment that smelled like smoke. And in the stories they tell later, they make it sound like romance and adventure, a girl given a title that sparkled in the candlelight, a wedding planned with jewels and choruses. But the truth is simpler and therefore crueler. The child bride is not a bride at all. She is a solution. She is a key in a lock that groans under old pressure. They dressed her in new silks. They laid a crown that pinched on her small skull. They put words in her mouth and placed her hand in a glove that belonged to a man not present. She learned to say yes. She learned to bow. She learned that when men smile and speak of security and honor, they mean hers will be spent like coin. A girl who has seen her father lowered by poison learns to count survival as a kind of love. She learned to say her prayers in whispers. She learned to keep to the edges of rooms. And so, the years unfolded not like gardens, but like pages in a legal ledger. Documents filed, rituals observed, the future stapled to a promised name. Magnus came, then went, the way men in service to larger empires come and go. He was older, clever, and bound himself to Moscow's designs, with a zeal that looks like devotion but smells like hunger. He played at kingship in a land where kingship was a costume, and in exchange he received what he wanted: titles, lands, access, and gave what he must: allegiance, a marriage to a girl whose blood could gild his pretense. When they stood under the watchful eyes of icons and priests and muttering boyars, the room was not crowded with romance. It was crowded with strategy. They bound their hands together in fabric. Beneath it, her fingers were cold and still. He vowed the things men vow in these rooms. She repeated the words taught to her the way a child repeats catechism. Perfectly, without understanding, as though comprehension would incur a penalty. There is a kind of cruelty reserved for children who are born valuable. It is not the cruelty of whips, it is the cruelty of plans. It is the enforced quiet of a life considered a corridor to other people's rooms. This was her daily bread. She ate it without choking because there is no other food for such children. When Magnus died, as all clever men in borrowed crowns eventually do, she was young and already old. Widowhood arrived on schedule, the way harvests do, already anticipated in the size of her attendants. The seal on her life cracked and flaked. For a moment, a thin line of air reached her chamber. Widowhood is, for some, a brief permission to breathe. NBUT, the world does not let a woman of her blood wander. Not when the tides shift in Moscow, not when the throne that never quite belonged to her begins to wobble in the hands of men who are not of her father's line. The child, now a woman, enters the gaze of another man who understands better than anyone how dangerous ghosts can be. NHI's name is Boris. To the chronicles, he is Godunov. To the city, he is the steward who became the master, the shadow that became the figure. To a woman like Maria, he is a weather system. NHE knows the mathematics of blood. He understands the equation that the city whispers in its sleep. Rurikid plus witness equals possibility. Possibility is a flower that feeds rebellions. He knows better than to let flowers bloom where the soil is so dark and so ready. NSO, the orders are not loud. They do not ring down corridors or cling in the streets. They are quiet, neat, whispered into the ears of men who never write their names. The girl who became a bride, who became a widow, becomes something else, domesticated absence. And it is perniciously simple to erase a person without laying a finger on her. Move her rooms further from the heart of power. Remove her attendants one by one and replace them with eyes that pretend to be hands. Let the letters she pens stray in the wrong direction and never arrive. Ask the church to concern itself with her soul. Build the walls not with stone, but with distance and protocol, and the very Russian word that keeps palaces safe. Decorum. NSHE walks new courtyards under birches that do not care who looks at them. She kneels in chapels where the candles burn to nubs, even when no one watches. She stitches at the frame set before her, fingers learning the patience that politics demands of women. She is not told she is a prisoner. She is told she is protected. Protection has a peculiar aroma when you are your father's daughter. It smells like the room at night when the corridor outside is too quiet. It smells like wax and old wood, and the far-off clank of keys you are not supposed to hear. NTHE City changes its mask. The terrible Tsar is gone. His sickly son takes the scepter and holds it the way a child holds a spear in a painting. All pose and no weight. Around him, Boris arranges the furniture of the state the way a brilliant but nervous host arranges chairs before a dangerous dinner. Maria knows these men by the voids they create when they pass. She knows them by the way the air changes when their names are spoken. NHER name is not spoken, not in public, not in the Duma, where matters of state are bundled and sorted. Her name is whispered in kitchens, in corridors, in rooms where candles are snuffed quickly after a sentence is finished. If they speak of her at all, they use the word past. They tuck her behind the screen where the country hides its inconvenient continuities. There is a minute of history when some imagine that, because she is out of sight, she must also be out of calculation. But men like Boris do not forget the arithmetic of blood. They count and count again, and in their counting an old truth emerges. Dead branches sprout shoots when you turn your back. He resolves to keep looking. Famine comes, as it always does when the skies forget themselves and the earth cracks open the way a mouth opens to beg. The city thins. Mothers barter rings for rye. Men weigh the meat of their oaths against the meat of their families. In those months, a woman like Maria becomes even more invisible. Hunger is the simplest censor. Who will waste a whisper on a cloistered princess when the oven is cold? And yet, in such seasons, the past becomes delicious to desperate men. Stories of rightful lines and unbroken blood move from mouth to mouth like illicit rations. Someone remembers a name. Someone else sketches a lineage in the air with a dirty finger. Somewhere, at the edge of hearing, the syllables of Staritsa rise like a tune remembered from a nursery. Boris hears tunes before others do. He always has. It is the talent that made him indispensable and then king. He hears the notes of Maria's name and tightens the cord that was already tight. There is no proclamation. No cloister gate slammed for the crowd's satisfaction, just a deepening of the quiet around her, the kind of silence that has weight and vector. NTHE convent is not a dungeon. Its walls are bright white, and the bells ring at the right times. The bread is simple and fresh when there is flour to be had. The sisters do not hate her, no more than they hate their own breath. They simply live, and living in such a place has a shape. The shape is repetition, obedience, renunciation. A woman whose childhood was traded for a treaty knows the texture of renunciation without anyone teaching her. She moves into it, not as into a new house, but as into a familiar coat, inherited, well-worn, ill-fitting, efficient. They might ask her to take a name. The dead sometimes claim us more honestly than the living. She might become a new Maria, a saint's name, a nod to the Mother of God who, at least in paintings, always looks like a woman who understands contracts written on a child's back. Or she might keep her given name in her mouth as a small rebellion, a way of telling herself that she still exists in a room where existence is spelled abnegation. News arrives like snowflakes on a warm sleeve, felt, seen, gone. Men shout that a boy thought murdered has returned to claim a father's throne. Others shout that he is a ghost or a liar, and in Russia those are sometimes the same accusation. The city lifts a new ruler in triumph and drops him out a window when the mood shifts. Fires burn. Bells toll. The convent bells answer because bells always answer when other bells cry. From her window she sees smoke, hears the echo of the square, feels the vibration of boots on frozen ground. History trembles past her like a procession in the next street. NDO, they offer her a bargain during those months? Perhaps a shadow comes, a man whose name is a rumor, to ask if she will bless a cause with her presence. Perhaps she says nothing, and the shadow melts. Perhaps she speaks the way a woman who has been careful her entire life speaks, without saying anything at all. It is a particular discipline, this refusal to be useful to anyone who has never, not once, considered being useful to you. NSHE is not a heroine in a romance who slips past guards with a bundle of bread and a forged pass. She is not Juliet, not Scheherazade. She is a Russian princess who learned too young that all the exits in her house lead to this room and this window and this prayer. If she runs, where would she run that her blood would not arrive before her? If she speaks, to whom would she speak that would not write her down as an argument for his own assent? NSO, she does the thing that looks like nothing and requires everything. She endures. And in the city beyond the convent, Boris is unseated by death, and death unseats him with the petty efficiency of a bureaucrat. One morning he is the axis around which the day turns. By night he is an empty chair. Men who hated him in whispers hate him in toasts. Men who loved him in public forget their grief, as swiftly as dogs forget insults when a new meat is thrown. The country enters the theater of impostors, and actors find their costumes where the bodies still lie. For Maria, every revolution of the outer wheel tightens the inner one. Each new claimant must take inventory, friends, enemies, liabilities, talismans. She is an object in every inventory, a variable to be contained. There are visits from men whose faces she does not care to remember, because remembering faces is a way of keeping promises you never made. There are questions whose answers are combed through for hints of allegiance. She speaks less and less, not because she is afraid. Fear has long since worn itself to the nub in her, but because language, for a woman of her situation, is raw currency and scarcity imposes economy. And in this arithmetic, time is both enemy and ally. It erases the guards who remember the first orders, and trains the new ones to enforce them without asking why. It dulls the appetite of conspirators who realize that a princess who does not wish to be rescued is heavier than a statue to carry. But it also offers her the one victory that people like her can steal, the victory of outlasting particular malices. Men leave office. Men die. Orders expire in the mouths of new masters who do not even know what they have inherited. And a cold winter pins the city beneath its palm. The convent coughs. The bread shrinks. The sisters pull their shawls tighter and pray with breath that fogs the icons. She watches the pattern of frost on the glass and thinks, perhaps, of the 8-year-old girl who stood in a gown too stiff for comfort, while men showed her the shape of her life and called it a blessing. She thinks of magnates and Magnus, of fathers and fatal cups, of kings who borrowed crowns and paid them back with their last breath. She considers how often the word protection has been applied to her, like salve applied to a bruise that never fades. There is a kindness among the women who share her bells. It is quiet, unrecorded kindness. The way a hand lingers a second longer with a cup, the way a shawl is laid across shoulders without comment. This is not the saga the city prefers to tell, but it is a kind of saga all the same. In places where men bend policy into instruments, women still pass bread to each other with careful fingers. NTHE thing about a life in confinement is that it makes you a scholar of smallness. You learn the seasons by the light on one floorboard. You become expert in the way dust dances when a door opens. You begin to measure the passage of years by the tone of a bell that has been replaced. Higher, perhaps, or flatter, and no one else seems to hear the change. These are not the measurements a royal tutor taught you, but they are precise, and you keep them the way you once kept the names of ancestors who were supposed to guarantee your safety, and at any point, she could have chosen to make a spectacle of her suffering. Some do. Some need the city to witness their pain for their pain to feel real. She does not. She was raised in a house where pain could get you killed if it showed its face. She wraps it and places it on a shelf and names it something else. Resignation, devotion, a girl's duty. And in naming it thus, she translates it into a language that no inquisitive man understands well enough to exploit. And it is tempting, years later, to read into her silence a grand philosophy, to say that she learned a holy secret about the vanity of power, to cast her as a sage who turned her back on the stage with its bright murders and took up a wisdom no one can stab. The truth is simpler and more costly. She turned her back because the stage rotated without her. She learned endurance because endurance was the only path through the wood that did not lead to the wolf's mouth. From time to time, an old name reaches her on the wind. A cousin, a half-remembered aunt, a boy who had the right to call her sister before the adults took that right and buried it under necessary cruelties. She holds the name in her mouth like bread and lets it dissolve there. She does not ask for news. News is another word for risk. Memories, on the other hand, are loyal if you feed them sparingly. There is a ledger somewhere, kept by a hand that believed in order. In it, a clerk with frozen fingers wrote the entries that keep countries from slipping into the swamp. Deliveries, appointments, permissions. In the margin of some winter page, a note. The Princess of Staritsa received such and such allowance, was moved from one set of rooms to another, was visited by a bishop, prayed at a certain hour, confessed on this date. Lines that reduce a life to a series of manageable facts. The clerks mean no harm. They rarely do. They are the ones who domesticate catastrophe into lists so that a city can pretend it is still itself. NIF. You read enough of those margins, you begin to see the outline of a person in the negative space. You see a girl given to a man because she was born inconvenient. You see a widow whose second wedding was to a silence that kept her alive by keeping her out of sight. You see a woman who died as she lived, deeply inconvenient and intensely polite. A danger neutralized, not by daggers but by doors that opened only inwards.